My lecture today is on Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And the title of it is, Are We on the Road to Serfdom? Socialism is a dangerous mistake. In its most extreme form of planning and oppression, it has killed millions. In its milder form, it is making us slide into unfreedom, a fate we can still avoid. In 1944, Hayek pointed this out in The Road to Serfdom by showing that socialism was but another form of collectivism, like communism and Nazism. It was a dire warning. The publication of Serfdom in England and in the US marked a change in Hayek's life. It closed a long period when he specialized in the economic theory of money and capital. At the age of 43, he was moved to writing this political book, as he called it. I should rather call it an essay in applied political economy. In any case, its unexpected success in the States and in England led him to shift his focus from economic theory to social philosophy for the rest of his life. When Hayek had lectured at LSE in 1931, somebody quipped that one could not tell whether the lecturer was a German professor trying to speak English or an Englishman trying to speak German. But in 1944, the language of serfdom was fluent and the matter clearly exposed. And more important, the doctrine rewardingly nonconformist. Serfdom was written in the middle of World War II. Hayek had been engaged in a book on the history of ideas, which he provisionally had called The Abuse and Decline of Reason. Though this book was never to be published or finished, it did result in momentous articles: The Counter-Revolution of Science, The Use of Knowledge in Society, and more importantly for us today, Individualism, True and False, because The Road to Serfdom could be called a summary of the philosophy in this third article. He suspended that historical project until after the war and moved to take a more active stance on current questions. He offered something more accessible for English public-minded readers, especially regarding the question of what kind of society would be built in England when the war was over. A lighter and more political essay could be more effective. He sat down to writing Serfdom. The least one can say of Serfdom is that it was a courageous book. Britain was alone facing the Nazi onslaught. Communist Russia was a precious ally. The thesis of the book was that Nazi philosophy had permeated English political life unnoticed, and that communism and Nazism were birds of a feather. Downright shocking, it must no doubt have been. The common thread in those two collectivist ideologies for Hayek, communism and fascism, was the proposal to base them on out-and-out centralized planning. So Hayek, in this essay, decided again to face the dangerous monster of centralized planning that Mises and himself thought they had killed and buried. Today, totally setting aside the free market and recommending a planned economy is thankfully out of fashion. The mistaken interventions and regulations of the state are at present more piecemeal than at the time of serfdom. Today, we must understand this essay as an analysis of, quote, the consequences of socialist policies, as he himself said in the preface to the 1975 edition. More comprehensively, we may see it as a root and branch rejection of all collective philosophies. To gauge the intellectual atmosphere at the time of writing, one need only to advert to Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, published in 1942 in the United States, just before Hayek's essay. What a contrast! The enduring success of some of Schumpeter's ideas make us close our eyes to the harm that this book caused then. Two shattering chapter headings indicate the tenor of the book and the reason for its success. Quote, "Can capitalism survive? No, I don't think it can." Unquote. And, quote, "Can socialism work? Of course it can." Unquote. Such assertions indicate what many people felt at the time. The keenness of Schumpeter's analysis and the intelligent picture he draws of both capitalism and socialism led readers astray. It was a case of being too clever by half. True, Schumpeter there presented other ideas that have proved interesting and fruitful, such as the concept of creative destruction. But he was mistaken in his prediction and fundamentally wrong-headed in his attitude to capitalism. Parts of Schumpeter, capitalist innovation, which he thought was impossible because of the resistance of established interests, capitalist innovation such as the internet and artificial intelligence are irresistible. They are routing the resistance of groups hostile to change that worried Schumpeter. Not only the groups of working class voters, but also established firms using current technology. Capitalism was fated to die, he said, unless the planning board faked a democracy and imposed innovation willy-nilly. For the purpose of this lecture, Schumpeter's famous book must be seen as an instance of the general inclination at the time in favor of socialist planning and against the free market, prejudices that serfdom will almost single-handedly fight it. A central element of serfdom is that ideas matter. Hayek stressed the fundamental change in German thought from liberalism and individualism to admiration for the centralized new German empire. The Enlightenment or Erklärung of the time of Johannes Goethe and Wilhelm von Humboldt, two German thinkers who inspired John Mill when writing on liberty, gave way to more tribal and nationalistic views of Germany, whose political initiator was Bismarck. But before this reversal in politics, a profound change had taken place in ideas. The seeds were sown by Hegel, Marx and Liszt. The individualism that had spread from England in the first 70 years of the 19th century was displaced by an admiration of state power and economic organization by the likes of Schmoller and Sombart. In its turn, this new liberalism spread westwards to England and France. The individualism of the countries where the Industrial Revolution started was replaced by German statism. This profound change was helped by the extraordinary progress of the centralized and monopolistic German economy in the last quarter of the 19th century. The high reputation of German scientists also helped. This is a time when Hayek places the inception of collectivism in Germany and Austria, which rolled over into France as denounced by Julien Bondin, and by the way to Spain. In Britain, the Webbs lay the ground. Lloyd George made his famous 1909 trip to Germany, where he converted to the Bismarck welfare state. Then as Chancellor under Asquith, he got the budget of the poor passed by Parliament. The liberalism of the disciples of Adam Smith, Cobden and Bright, was quite forgotten and gave way to the new liberalism of George Bernard Shaw and Lasky. The Bolshevik Revolution and the Fascist Revolution of 1917 and 1922 intrigued and seduced intellectuals in France and Britain. The point Hayek wanted to make was that the aggressivity of Nazi Germany was not due to some genetic inclination of the German race, but to the anti-liberal ideology that had been spreading on the continent since before World War I and now seemed to have infected Britain. Individualism was being replaced by nationalism, a form of collectivism. The 15 chapters of the book, now to turn to the contents of the Road to Serfdom, were preceded by an introduction contrasting the traditional classical liberalism with the utopia of democratic socialism. The socialist promise of a new liberty he described as empty, because the centralized planning of a socialist economy would necessarily turn out to be oppressive. The collectivism of Russia, Italy, and Germany in the 30s was no unfortunate coincidence, but the essence of the planned society they were building. The challenge faced by individualist societies was life-threatening and could not rest on a mere rehashing of laissez-faire. It had to be organized around a rational framework of competition. This idea that Hayek did not back laissez-faire and was in fact thought it was incomplete is a new thing I got from the reading of The Road to Serfdom. Hayek's rejection of pure laissez-faire is a surprising pronouncement in a defender of the free market. Then came 4 chapters on central planning. There he rejected the belief that planning is inevitable, that planning can be democratic, that it is compatible with the rule of law, and that it need not slide into totalitarianism. This last idea is linked with one of the most famous parts of the essay, the chapter titled Why the Worst Get on Top. Planning is based on the disputable assumption of a benevolent planner. Oskar Lange, the Polish economist, socialist economist, when he presented his theory of market socialism, held the question of planners mainly caring for their own personal interests to be a matter not for economics, but for psychology, a neat way of disposing of an insurmountable difficulty. Hayek, on the contrary, showed why the worst do indeed get on top in a planned economy. Hayek, in an important chapter that is the most relevant today, titled Who, Whom, examines the question of just distribution and fair wages with due skepticism. He points out that the quoted phrase is Lenin's, who saw the difficulty at the heart of political distribution and solved it rather abruptly. The widespread idea that distribution must be governed by merit is impracticable, says Hayek. The idea of a meritocracy is just empty and misleading. Who would decide what distribution is fair? Distribution is in fact governed by the resulting satisfaction of the users of resources and the consumers of goods and services, not by a consideration of the labours of the producers. Adam Smith has been presented as the originator of the labour theory of value. Adam Smith was no Austen. He proposed the quantity of labour as a measure of relative prices, not the cause of value. It was Ricardo who made the mistake when simplifying the model. This, by the way. Hayek proceeded to examine what Orwell in 1984 called newspeak, the culpable change in the meaning of words to ease the acceptance of collectivism in freedom-loving countries. Thus, liberty is used as a synonym for national power, democracy to signify the imposition of collective values by majority vote, and truth is turned into propaganda. Then come two applied chapters, the socialist roots of Nazism and the totalitarians in our midst, where he insists on the dangers for liberty posed by socialism. The very titles of these chapters must have shocked and shock today, because socialism is back in fashion. Hayek was right to dedicate serfdom to the socialists of all parties. Socialism gives the comfort of security, but certainly undermines innovation and freedom. Today's reader should not be put off by Hayek's continuous attention to overall central planning. He was fighting the almost irresistible fashion of the day. The critique of wholesale planning does not cover all the lessons of the book, especially not the contribution to his contributions to a critical evaluation of socialism. The final demise of French indicative planning has led interventionism to change its ways. Planning is still present, but it has become piecemeal. It takes the form of national health service, government industrial policy, trade protectionism, maximum prices, minimum wages, and government direct financing of jobs. Since socialism is again on the rise in the West, serfdom is as relevant as ever. The above list of mistaken state policies will ring a bell with present-day readers. Now, I want to draw another comparison, the one I made with Schumpeter and now with Mises. The difference between Mises and Hayek, they were master and disciple, are often glossed over by insisting that they both are fundamental members of an Austrian school of economics. I tend to avoid labels. I remember Gary Becker recounting with a smile that he'd been told that he was an Austrian economist. I must underline that Hayek does not propose a night watchman state, as the saying goes. He criticizes laissez-faire as too simple a policy of general intervention. I was surprised, as you may be, at his rejection of that kind of basic policy. This reminds me of an oft-recorded incident at the founding of the Mont Pèlerin Society in 1947. After hearing the assembled social scientists attack laissez-faire and propose a state agenda, Ludwig von Mises left the room, banged the door after crying out, "You are a bunch of socialists." This shows a little remarked difference of opinion between Mises and Hayek, which can be read between the lines of serfdom. Hayek insisted that the defense of the free market based merely on laissez-faire was not up to the job. He called it a mere slogan, a dogmatic, I'm quoting here, a dogmatic rough rule of the thumb, unquote. A fairly ambiguous description of the principles on which liberal policy is based, unquote. The final damning of this remarks is as follows. The successful, and I'm quoting it, the successful use of competition as the principal social organization precludes certain types of coercive interference with economic life, but admits of others which sometimes may very considerably assist its work and even requires certain kinds of government action. So, for Hayek, competition, not laissez-faire, is the guiding principle for a free society. Von Mises' attitude towards laissez-faire is quite different from Hayek's. For Mises, arriving at a free society is an endogenous phenomenon that need no outside legal framework except property rights, free prices, and free trade. For Hayek, the constitutional conditions for a free society must be established exogenously, along the lines of the Ordo, German Ordo school. When Mises wrote Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis in 1922, he was not detailing the steps to be taken to lead to a free market society. He was showing the end state. His aim was to prove that socialism could not work and that one could be confident that once the drive towards socialism was abandoned, full freedom would spontaneously appear. His great work, Human Action, was a treatise on laissez-faire, on, quote, capitalism-based praxeology, not on how to get from here to there. Also, his method of achieving knowledge was purely deductive, not very convincing for the unconverted. He despised statistics as only history and thought it afforded no guide for the future. When we look at Mises' final aim of anarcho-capitalism, we look at it with interest, but feel we would tread that path with less trepidation if deductions were coupled with well-directed empirics. Hayek was open to history, statistics, and empiricism. At bottom, Mises was a metaphysical utilitarian. But, as Robbins remarked then, it is only in a state of total war that one dare speak of social utility. It is not so much that one can compare and aggregate the cardinal utilities of individuals so as to obtain a single welfare function for society, but that individuals refuse to have their wishes lumped together with those of others under a single social aim. The limits, and I quote here, the limits of this sphere of personal decision are determined by the extent to which individuals agree on particular ends, and probability that they agree on a particular course of action necessarily decreases as the scope of action extends. This intuitive reflection on the possible lack of agreement on social or common ends has been reinforced by present-day social choice theory. I have recently written on Arrow's impossibility theorem, whereby an agreement over very simply defined social welfare functions cannot be implemented unless by a dictator. Hayek was no anarcho-capitalist and said so, though it does not seem that he came under the direct influence of the Freiburg school. There are similarities of approach between Hayek and the Ordo group. Hayek made a big effort to invite Wilhelm Röpke to the first Mont Pèlerin meeting. True, Hayek rejected some of the limits to individualism proposed by Walter Eucken. For that school, a competitive order was indeed the best way to organize society, but one needed a framework of law and state action for freedom to produce the best results. The question is, in what way did Hayek describe the framework of legal and political institutions that were needed to complete and better the old reliance on laissez-faire? We shall see, but in the road to servitude, we don't have the detail as we have in another book. Now, by the way, I want to say something about the consequences of this idea that you cannot have social welfare functions, full stop. I quote about in the part of the book about international trade. Quote, "Who imagines that there exists any common ideas of distributive justice such as will make the Norwegian fisherman consent to forego the prospect of economic improvement in order to help his Portuguese fellow, or the Dutch worker to pay more for his bicycle to help the Coventry mechanic, or the French to pay more taxes to assist the industrialization of Italy." This is the application of the arrow impossibility theorem to the United Europe. What Hayek is saying is that social welfare functions are pure fiction and, in fact, strictly impossible. Antonio here declares himself surprised as to how nuanced and moderate Hayek's position was in serfdom. Contrary to what many have said, especially Keynes, there was no fatalistic conclusion that liberty was on the way to assured destruction. The conclusion was conditional, not necessary. Much self-satisfied comment has been uttered by liberal writers pointing that there's still no concentration camps in democracy, in our democracies. I would not sound so triumphant. What with the slow spread of collectivist autocracies, the growing rejection of free international trade, the deepening of our welfare state in crisis, and a growing hostility against currents of immigration that should be welcome. Hayek argued in favor of a system of extensive social services if the supply was totally neutral as to the recipients. Hayek was always ready to learn, and I think he would have looked askance at the actual effects of national insurance proposals on finance and personal morality, and also his proposal to attend the demand for security by ordinary people was witness to his readiness to look at reality. A position of Hayek's that is often misunderstood, and I must say and insist that it confused me, is the fact that an untiring critic of constructivism should engage in a detailed description of a proposed constitution. By constructivism, Hayek meant the preconceptions originating in Descartes and reinforced by Hobbes and Rousseau that all beneficial institutions in human societies were the result of conscious design, and that only such rationalist design guaranteed their social utility. In Hayek's words, he rejected the idea of constructive rationalism, a conception which assumes that all social institutions are and ought to be the product of deliberate design. If we look at the contents of Volume 3 of Law, Legislation and Liberty of 1979, tellingly named The Political Order of a Free People, the impression of constructivism is very strong. Hayek presented and designed, listen to these words, a model constitution, a move that does not seem in accordance with the views of a believer in the spontaneous order as the basis of free society. What we've discovered after reading, a thorough reading of serfdom in this lecture, is that a simplified understanding of the book will not show its true complexity. As I repeatedly explained, his is not an argument for elementary laissez-faire reforms. A complete framework of law and institutions is necessary to protect the liberty of a free people. That is what Book 3 tries to do. This kind of detail is surprising in an author who insists on spontaneous evolution of law and wishes to limit politics to decisions under the law. This poses a real problem of interpretation that I think can be solved by referring to the distinctive philosophical character of serfdom. This review of serfdom, reinterpretation of serfdom, gives that book special utility, makes it especially useful. Hayek was indeed no traditionalist. He was no conservative. He admitted change in the law, but it had to be along the lines of this model and this model's constitution. In the field of philosophy, he also was a continuous innovator. One need only refer to how around 1971, a new period in his life opened when he turned his attention to natural and social evolution, in collaboration, I must say, with his friend Karl Popper. At the end of the very volume 3 that we are examining, and so much shocked this reader, he inserted a quasi-Darwinian epilogue, which I found profoundly inspiring. It's titled The Three Sources of Human Values. He moved away from the deductivist mode of Mises and Nozick to a more empirical conception of philosophy. But that discussion is for another day. Thank you.